The midday sun reluctantly filtered through the tall windows of the Cleveland County Courthouse, tracing geometric patterns of light across the wooden floor. The old building, steeped in the smell of wood and paper dust, had seen many high-profile trials, but today's case had caused many local residents to put their affairs on hold and fill the public gallery to capacity. In the dock sat David Wilson, a tall man of 40 with closely cropped hair and a tense expression. His dark skin looked gray under the harsh light of the lamps, and his hands, folded on his knees, trembled noticeably. Not long ago, he had been a respected manager of a construction company, a father preparing for the birth of his long-awaited child. Now, he was accused of first-degree murder. Judge Lorraine Moore, a woman with gray hair and neatly braided braids and an expression that brooked no argument, banged her gavel, calling for silence. "The prosecution calls its last witness," announced Prosecutor Terrence Holloway, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Rachel Wilson." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Everyone knew that this moment would be the climax of the trial. Rachel Wilson, the 35-year-old wife of the defendant, and, as the investigation had revealed, the mistress of the murdered Chanel Brown, was a key witness. The courtroom doors opened and Rachel entered, a slender woman of medium height with short hair and expressive eyes. Her pregnancy, already visible under her loose ivory dress, added a special drama to the proceedings. She slowly made her way to the witness stand, avoiding looking at her husband, but everyone in the courtroom could feel the invisible thread connecting them. Detective Thomas Clark, sitting in the front row at the prosecution table, tensed. He had been working on this case from the beginning, and it was his painstaking work that had led to David Wilson's arrest. Now, everything could be decided in a matter of minutes. After the oath was taken, the prosecutor began his questioning. "Mrs. Wilson, do you understand that you are under oath and must tell the truth?" "Yes." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Tell the court where you were on the night of April 15th, when Chanel Brown was murdered." Rachel took a deep breath. "I was at home with my husband, David. We watched TV all evening and went to bed around 11 p.m. The prosecutor froze, clearly not expecting that answer. "Are you saying that the defendant did not leave your home between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.? "That's correct." Rachel nodded. "We were together the entire time." The prosecutor's face tensed. He flipped through several pages of his notes. "Mrs. Wilson, earlier in your statement to the police, you said you weren't sure if your husband was home all night because you took a sleeping pill and slept soundly." "I was stressed after I found out about Chanel's death. Now that I've thought it through, I remember clearly that David was with me." Detective Clark frowned as he made notes in his notebook. He knew all too well what was going on. A classic case of a spouse providing an alibi for the accused, despite all the evidence. But here the situation was more complicated. Rachel was not only defending her husband, but also indirectly covering for her lover's murderer. The prosecutor continued his questioning, trying to catch Rachel in a contradiction, but she remained surprisingly calm, repeating her version of events. According to her, David couldn't have killed Chanel because he had been with her all night. Clark mentally reviewed the evidence. Tire tracks from David's car had been found near the crime scene, a secluded alley in the park where Chanel Brown's body had been found with multiple stab wounds, calls from David's phone to the victim's number that evening, a witness who saw a car similar to the defendant's in the park area around midnight, and most importantly, the motive, a complicated love triangle that they were now trying to deny. "Mrs. Wilson," the prosecutor changed tactics, "were you romantically involved with the deceased, Chanel Brown?" Rachel lowered her eyes, her hands falling unconsciously to her stomach, as if protecting her unborn child from the weight of this confession. "Yes, we were in a relationship." "And did your husband know about this relationship?" "He found out shortly before what happened to Chanel." "How did he react?" "He was upset, of course. We talked a lot. It was a difficult time, but we decided to stay together for the sake of the child." "Doesn't it seem strange to you that shortly after your husband found out about your affair, your lover was found murdered?" "Objection!" David's defense attorney jumped to his feet. "Leading question. Objection sustained." The judge nodded. "Reword the question, Mr. Holloway." The prosecutor sighed. "Mrs. Wilson, were you aware of any conflicts between your husband and Chanel Brown?" They hardly spoke. Rachel shook her head. David is not an aggressive man. He never raised his hand, even in the most tense situations. Thomas Clark continued to observe Rachel, noting the slightest nuances in her behavior. The slight tremor in her hands, her evasive gaze, the pause before some of her answers. The detective had seen enough false testimony to recognize it. But there was something else here, not just lies, but a complex web of truth, fear, and perhaps guilt. When the prosecutor finished his questioning, the defense declined to cross-examine, apparently satisfied with Rachel's performance. The judge adjourned until the next day, and the courtroom began to empty. Detective Clark remained seated, staring at his notes. Assistant District Attorney Luke Johnson, a young, ambitious lawyer with a keen gaze, approached him. "This is a disaster," Johnson said quietly as they stepped into the hallway. "Her testimony destroys our entire case." Clark shook his head slowly. "She's lying. I saw the cell phone records. David Wilson's phone was registered at Towers near the park at the exact time his wife said he was at home. She can say he left his phone in the car and borrowed a friend's car." Johnson shrugged. "Juries want to believe the best. A pregnant woman defending her husband is a powerful image. Something doesn't add up here." Clark rubbed his nose. "Why would she defend the murderer of her lover, even if he's her husband?" "Fear? Dependency? Guilt?" Johnson suggested. "We have no direct evidence, only circumstantial, and now we have an alibi from the wife. We need to dig deeper into their relationship," Clark said decisively. "Something happened between these three people that led to the murder. And Rachel knows more than she's telling us." "We only have 1 day left before closing arguments," Johnson reminded him. "I'm not sure we'll have time to find anything substantial." "I'll talk to Chanel's friend again," Clark was adamant. "And I'll check the phone records for the week before the murder. There must be something we missed." They parted ways, agreeing to meet later. Detective Clark headed for the courthouse exit when he noticed Rachel standing apart from the main flow of people. Their eyes met for a moment, and Clark thought he saw not triumph at her successful testimony, but a deep, painful longing. Rachel quickly turned away and walked toward the exit, her shoulders tense and her gait unnaturally stiff. Clark suppressed the urge to approach her. Now was not the time. But he was certain that behind the facade of her testimony lay a real story, and he was determined to uncover it. That evening, Rachel Wilson returned to the small but well-kept house she shared with David in the suburbs of Cleveland. The quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other had now become a place of intense scrutiny and whispered gossip. Neighbors who had once greeted her warmly now preferred to look away or, conversely, stare too intently, trying to see traces of the scandalous story that had filled the local news. The house greeted her with silence. Rachel slowly walked into the bedroom, took off her formal dress, and put on her home clothes. Every movement was difficult, as if her body was resisting the mundane actions in this unbearable situation. She sat down on the edge of the bed and took the photo from her last ultrasound out of the bedside table. A small, blurry image. Their future child. A girl, according to the doctor. The child that she and David had been waiting for years, going through disappointments and failed attempts. The child who could now be born while his father was behind bars. Tears streamed down her cheeks, silent but burning. Rachel hadn't cried in court, hadn't allowed herself to break down in front of the prosecutor and the jury. But here, in the silence of her home, the pain and fear overwhelmed her with renewed force. "Rachel." She started at the sound. David was standing in the doorway. His lawyer had secured his release on bail pending trial. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his face wore an expression she couldn't quite place, a mixture of gratitude for her testimony today and agonizing guilt. "I didn't hear you come in," Rachel said quietly, trying to wipe away her tears. David took an uncertain step into the room, stopping at a distance from her. "You were very convincing today," he said finally. "Thank you." That simple thank you hung between them like a heavy, unbearable weight. It concealed too much: unspoken accusations, regrets, fear, despair, and the ghost of Chanel Brown, whose murdered body now bound them forever by a shared secret. Rachel stared silently at the photo in her hands. David followed her gaze and his face softened. "Everything will be okay," he said without much conviction. "We'll get through this for her." Rachel didn't answer. Her thoughts returned to the courtroom, to the prosecutor's questions, to the lies she had told under oath, to Detective Clark, whose piercing gaze seemed to see right through her. How long could she keep up this lie? And what price would they all have to pay in the end? Behind her, David stood motionless in the doorway, watching his wife, his face reflecting a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude for her defense today and deep, lingering guilt for what had brought them to this moment. Cleveland City Hospital was bathed in the cold October light. Rachel Wilson was finishing her 12-hour shift in the emergency room. Her hands, encased in latex gloves, skillfully treated a wound on the forehead of the next patient, a middle-aged man who had been injured in a domestic accident. Over the years as a nurse, she had learned to perform such procedures almost automatically, while maintaining a friendly expression and engaging in reassuring conversation. "Next," Rachel said, removing her gloves and tossing them into a medical waste container. She glanced at her watch. She had 30 minutes left on her shift. "Car accident patient," said the nurse on duty, handing her the chart. "Bay 3, cuts from broken glass, condition stable." Rachel nodded and headed for the designated bay. Pulling back the curtain, she saw a young woman sitting on the edge of the couch. Despite a small cut on her cheek and her disheveled hair, she was strikingly beautiful. High cheekbones, expressive dark eyes, and lips curved in a slight smile, despite the circumstances. "Miss Brown?" Rachel checked her chart. "Chanel Brown?" "Yes, that's me." The woman's voice was deep and melodious. "Although, to be honest, I feel like a complete idiot. Crashing into a pole on an empty road. You have to be good at it." Rachel smiled as she examined the cut on the patient's cheek. "Believe me, I've seen worse. It's nothing serious, but it might leave a scar if it's not treated properly." Their eyes met, and Rachel felt an unexpected thrill. There was something special about the way Chanel looked at her, with open interest and an almost admiring gaze. "You have very caring hands," Chanel said, as Rachel began to treat the cut. "Have you been working here long?" "Almost 10 years, Rachel replied, trying to focus on the procedure rather than the warmth emanating from the patient's skin. "What do you do?" "I'm a photographer." Chanel winced slightly at the touch of the antiseptic. "I specialize in portraits. I love capturing people's real emotions, the things they usually hide." Rachel felt Chanel's searching gaze on her again and wondered what emotions the woman saw in her. "All done," she said, sticking on the last strip of tape. "You'll need to change the bandage every day and make sure it doesn't get infected." Chanel took a business card out of her purse. "If you have any questions about my condition, or if you just want to talk." She handed Rachel the card with a smile that left no doubt about her intentions. Rachel should have returned the card, saying it was unprofessional and that she had a husband. Instead, she took the card and hid it in the pocket of her medical gown. "Take care of yourself, Miss Brown." "Chanel, please," she replied, never taking her eyes off Rachel. "And I hope we see each other again, Rachel." After her shift, Rachel sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for a long time, staring at Chanel's business card. Something inside her, something that had been dormant for a long time, suddenly awakened and demanded attention. She thought about her husband, about David, who was probably already home from work and waiting for her. She thought about their quiet, measured life, about the years they had spent trying to have a child, about the disappointments and the gradual fading of their passion. She put the card in her purse and started the car. But thoughts of Chanel Brown stayed with her on the drive home. Later, as she prepared dinner for David, and during their usual evening conversation about their day. "How was your day?" David asked, mechanically flipping through the TV channels. He looked tired after a long day at work, his dark eyes half closed. "The usual," Rachel replied, not mentioning her meeting with Chanel. "How about you?" "Problems with suppliers," he rubbed his forehead. "I may have to go to Cincinnati next week." David continued talking about work, but Rachel was only half listening. Their conversations had long since become a routine exchange of information, devoid of any real interest in each other. They had been together for 12 years, and for most of the last 5, they had been trying to have a baby. Every month brought hope and disappointment, doctors, tests, procedures. All of it had slowly sucked the life out of their relationship. turning what had once been a passionate union into a partnership with a common goal. The next day, Rachel held her phone in her hands, staring at the number on Chanel's business card. She hesitated, typing and deleting a message. Finally, she wrote a short one. "How's your cheek? Rachel from the hospital." Chanel replied almost immediately, and soon they agreed to meet at a cafe near the hospital, just to talk, Rachel told herself. That first meeting marked the beginning of something Rachel couldn't even explain to herself. Chanel was the complete opposite of David, impulsive, passionate, living in the moment. She talked about her photography, her travels, her dreams, and in her words, Rachel heard echoes of her own youth, her forgotten desires. "Did you always want to be a nurse?" Chanel asked, during their third meeting, as they walked along the shore of Lake Erie. "Not really," Rachel smiled at the memory. "I dreamed of being an artist. I painted all the time when I was a teenager." "What happened?" "Life," Rachel shrugged. "My mother got sick and we needed money. Nursing school guaranteed a job. Then I met David, we got married, and somehow, things just turned out differently." "Do you still paint?" "No, I gave it up a long time ago." Chanel stopped and took her hands. "It's never too late to go back to what you love." There was something in her words, in her touch, that made Rachel believe that it really wasn't too late. It wasn't too late to feel, to dream, to be herself. Their relationship developed rapidly. What began as friendly meetings quickly grew into something more. Their first kiss happened in Chanel's studio, where she was showing her work. It was tender, uncertain, but it opened the floodgates of emotions that Rachel had kept under control for so long. "I'm married," she whispered, pulling away. "I know," Chanel replied, not letting go of her hand. "But you're unhappy, Rachel. I can see it in your eyes." Was she unhappy? Rachel couldn't say for sure. Her marriage to David wasn't terrible. It was bland, like food without spices, like a song without a melody. They existed side by side, cared for each other, but somewhere along the way they lost the spark that once bound them together. Chanel breathed new life into her. They met in secret, at Chanel's studio, in remote cafes, sometimes in motels outside the city. Rachel felt reborn, discovering new sides of herself, of her sensuality. David, immersed in his work and accustomed to their quiet life, did not notice the changes in his wife's behavior at first. Her sudden meetings with friends, new clothes, and the sparkle in her eyes all passed him by. He was a good man and a caring husband, but he hadn't really looked at Rachel in a long time. Michael Turner, David's best friend since high school, was more observant. One evening, as he and David sat in the Wilsons' backyard with a bottle of beer, Michael cautiously broached the subject. "Rachel seems kind of different lately," he said, looking up at the starry sky. "Haven't you noticed?" David frowned, taking a sip of beer. "Different how?" "I don't know," Michael shrugged. "She seems to glow from within. It happens when a person what?" David tensed. "When a person is in love," Michael finished quietly. David was silent for a long time, looking at his house, where Rachel's figure was visible in the kitchen window, talking on the phone. Her face was animated. She was smiling at something the invisible person on the other end was saying. "We're trying to have a baby," David finally said. "Maybe she's just hoping." But the seed of doubt had been sown. David began to notice details that had previously escaped his attention. The way Rachel checked her phone even when they were together. The way she came home with sparkling eyes and a blush on her cheeks. The way she distanced herself from him when he tried to be physically intimate. The situation changed one November morning when Rachel came out of the bathroom with a pale face and a pregnancy test in her hands. "It's positive," she whispered. "David, I'm pregnant." The news completely changed the course of their lives. David was beside himself with happiness. Finally, after so many years of waiting, they were going to be parents. He showered Rachel with attention, started planning the nursery, and talked about their child's future. For Rachel, the news of her pregnancy was a turning point of a different kind. She stared at the test, feeling a mixture of joy and horror. The child they had waited so long for was now growing inside her, while she was leading a double life, cheating on her husband with another woman. That same day, she met with Chanel at her studio and told her about the pregnancy. "That's wonderful news," Chanel said, hugging her. "You'll be a wonderful mother." "I can't go on like this," Rachel pulled away, looking Chanel in the eyes. "What we have, it has to end. For the baby, for my family." Chanel's face changed. The smile disappeared, her eyes darkened. "You can't just end it like this." Her voice grew harder. "What we have is real, Rachel. You love me, I know it. I'm pregnant, Chanel. That changes everything. It doesn't change anything." Chanel grabbed her hands. "We can be together. You, me, and your baby." "Get away from him, Rachel. He doesn't even notice who you really are." "I can't." Rachel shook her head, freeing her hands. "I'm sorry. It was a mistake from the start." She left Chanel's studio with a heavy heart, but determined to start over. For the sake of the child, for the sake of the family she and David had tried so hard to build. She deleted Chanel's number from her phone and blocked her on social media, trying to cut off all avenues of temptation. But Chanel wasn't going to let their relationship go so easily. First, there were calls from unknown numbers, then emails. When Rachel ignored them, Chanel started showing up at the hospital during her shifts, sending flowers to her workplace with notes full of pleas and threats. "Who are the flowers from?" David asked when Rachel brought home another bouquet, unable to bring herself to throw it away at the hospital. "From a patient," she lied, "to thank me for my care." David nodded, but something flashed in his eyes. Doubt, suspicion. Rachel couldn't tell for sure. She only knew that their home, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, a place full of tension and unspoken words. The situation reached a critical point when Chanel began showing up near their house. Once, Rachel came home from work and saw her sitting in her car across the street. Another time, David mentioned seeing a strange woman taking pictures of their house. Michael Turner, who was visiting them at the time, noticed the growing tension between the couple. David was becoming increasingly withdrawn and spending more time at work. Rachel looked frightened, constantly checking the windows and doors and flinching at the sound of the phone ringing. "What's going on, buddy?" Michael asked when he and David were sitting in the yard again, now in tense silence instead of their usual conversation. "I don't know." David shook his head. "Rachel's hiding something. I can feel it, but I can't figure out what." "Have you talked to her?" "I tried. She says everything's fine, that it's just pregnancy hormones." Michael looked at his friend, usually so confident. David now looked lost and frightened. "Give her time," Michael said, though he didn't believe the problem would resolve itself. Pregnancy is a difficult time. That evening, after Michael left, Rachel's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and paled. Another unknown number, but she knew who it was. David noticed her reaction. "Who is it?" he asked, watching his wife reject the call. "Just spam," Rachel replied, but her voice trembled. A minute later, a message arrived. Rachel quickly grabbed her phone, but David was faster. He took the device from her hands and read the text on the screen. "You can't hide forever. I won't let you go, Rachel. We belong together. If it's not you, it's no one." David's face changed. Bewilderment gave way to shock, then anger. "What does that mean?" His voice was quiet, but it rang with steel. "Who is this, Rachel?" She sat there, unable to look up, feeling the house of cards she had so carefully built over the past few weeks crumbling around her. "I can explain," she whispered. "Explain," David continued, still holding the phone, his hand shaking. At that moment, they heard a car pulling up. They both went to the window and saw Chanel getting out of the car across the street from their house. Even from a distance, she looked extremely agitated. Her movements were jerky, her face contorted with emotion. "Who is that?" David asked again, although Rachel could see from his eyes that he already knew. "Chanel," Rachel replied quietly. "Her name is Chanel Brown." "And who is she to you?" Rachel closed her eyes, feeling tears running down her cheeks. We had a relationship." The silence that followed this confession was deafening. David stood motionless, looking from his wife to the woman outside, who was now heading toward their door. "How long?" His voice was barely audible. A few months. But it's over, David. I ended it when I found out I was pregnant. But she obviously doesn't think so. David nodded toward the window. There was a loud knock on the door. Rachel, Chanel's voice echoed down the street. I know you're in there. We need to talk. David slowly turned toward the door, his face a mask of rage and pain. I'll talk to her, he said, taking a step forward. David, no! Rachel grabbed his arm. She's not herself, please, let's just call the police. But David was already opening the door, stepping out to meet the woman who had destroyed his family, his future, his faith in his wife. Chanel stood in the doorway, beautiful, fierce, her eyes filled with despair. Where's Rachel? She demanded when she saw David. I need to talk to her. Go away. David's voice was icy. Leave my wife alone. Your wife? Chanel laughed bitterly. She loves me, not you. She's just afraid to admit it. David stood with his fists clenched, his body tense as a string. Get off my property or I'll call the police. Go ahead. Chanel took a step forward. Let everyone know that your pregnant wife slept with me while you were working late. Let everyone know how she moaned my name, how... Rachel appeared in the doorway, her face wet with tears. Chanel, please, she begged. Go away. It's over. No, Chanel shook her head. It's not over until I say it's over. You belong to me, Rachel, and that baby could be ours too. We can raise it together, love it together. David stepped forward, placing himself between his wife and Chanel. You're sick, he said. Get out now, or I won't be responsible for myself. Chanel looked at him with undisguised hatred. You think you've won, she hissed. But you haven't. I won't back down. I'll come here every day, call her, write to her. I'll be with her at the hospital, at the store, everywhere. And one day she'll realize that her place is with me. Rachel saw her husband's back tense, his hands clenching into fists even tighter. Chanel continued, each word like a knife stabbing into their marriage, into their future. You'll never get her back. Chanel's face contorted into a triumphant grimace. She's mine, and the baby will be mine too. At that moment, Rachel saw something change in David's posture. The tension building inside him had reached a breaking point. He took a quick step toward Chanel, his voice low and threatening. Get out of my house, away from my wife, away from my child, now. But Chanel just laughed in his face and turned to Rachel. Tell him, Rachel. Tell him you love me. Tell him you never felt for him the way you feel for me. At that moment, Rachel saw something in her husband's eyes she had never seen before. Pure, uncontrollable rage. She realized that the triangle between them had taken an unexpected and dangerous turn. Rain drummed on the roof of the Cleveland Police Department, creating a monotonous noise that only intensified the atmosphere of anxious anticipation. Detective Thomas Clark sat at his desk, buried in documents related to the Chanel Brown case. The trial of David Wilson was nearing its conclusion, but Clark couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping through his fingers. Rachel Wilson's testimony in court had turned everything upside down. She had given her husband an alibi that contradicted the evidence. But why? What could have made a woman defend the murderer of her lover? Clark rubbed his nose and reopened the folder with photos from the crime scene. Chanel Brown's body had been found in Edgewater Park early in the morning of April 15th. A young woman with multiple stab wounds. A brutal, emotional murder committed in a state of intense emotion. The ringing of the phone snapped the detective out of his thoughts. Clark, he answered. Detective, this is Tiffany Green. Did you leave me a message? Clark sat up straight. Tiffany Green was a colleague and close friend of Chanel's, whom he had already interviewed at the beginning of the investigation. Yes, Miss Green. Thank you for calling back. I'd like to talk to you again about Chanel. Some new information has come to light, and I need to clarify a few details. Of course. Tiffany's voice sounded tired. When? If possible, today. 2 hours later, Tiffany Green was sitting across from the detective in a small conference room at the police station. She was a tall, slender woman with short hair and an attentive gaze. She was wearing a strict black suit. She had come straight from work at the photo studio where she and Chanel had worked together. I heard that the defendant's wife gave him an alibi, Tiffany said, taking a cup of coffee from Clark. Is that true? Unfortunately, yes, the detective nodded. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I need more information about Chanel's last days. You were close? She might have told you about her relationship with Rachel Wilson? Tiffany shook her head slowly, as if she still couldn't believe what had happened. Chanel changed a lot in the months before her death. At first, she was happy, in love, inspired. She said she had met a special woman, but she didn't name names. Then she became obsessed. When Rachel tried to break them up, Chanel refused to accept it. She said they were meant for each other, that Rachel was just afraid of her feelings. Did she ever threaten Rachel or her husband? Clark asked, taking notes. Tiffany looked away, clearly uncomfortable. In the last few weeks, Chanel became obsessive. She followed Rachel around, called her constantly, sent her messages. I tried to talk to her, to tell her it wasn't healthy, but she wouldn't listen. She said Rachel was pregnant, and that this child could be their happiness together. It sounded crazy. Did you know she was in contact with Rachel's husband? No, she didn't mention that, but Tiffany hesitated. But? Clark leaned forward. The day before she died, Chanel was in a terrible state. She came to my house late at night, drunk and in tears. She said that if Rachel didn't come back to her, she'd regret it, that she wouldn't let that man keep Rachel. I'd never seen her like that, so obsessed and angry. Clark wrote it down. The picture was starting to come into focus. Miss Green, after Chanel died, did you find anything among her things? Maybe a diary, notes related to Rachel? Tiffany silently opened her bag and took out a smartphone in a worn case. Her phone. The police returned her belongings to me after the initial investigation, but I didn't look at the phone right away. When I finally charged it and opened it, she shook her head. There are hundreds of messages from Rachel, photos of their house, recordings of conversations. I think you should see this. Clark took the phone cautiously. Do you know the password? Her birthday, February 14th, 1994. Tiffany replied. She always used that for all her passwords. Clark unlocked the phone and began scrolling through the messages. Sure enough, there were hundreds of texts sent to Rachel, ranging from tender declarations of love to explicit threats. In the days leading up to her death, the tone of the messages had become increasingly aggressive. If you don't answer, I'm coming to your house. I'll tell everyone about us if you keep ignoring me. This child shouldn't grow up with him. We could raise him together. If I can't have you, no one will. But the most disturbing thing was the call log. The day before the murder, Chanel had called not only Rachel, but also David Wilson's number, 3 times. And in the records folder, Clark found an audio file dated the day of the murder, early in the evening. He pressed play and heard Chanel's voice, distorted by emotion and possibly alcohol. Listen to me carefully, David. I know you're keeping her. Rachel loves me, not you. That child could have been ours. If I can't have her, you won't either. I'm taking her and that child, and there's nothing you can do about it. Clark turned off the recording and looked at Tiffany. Have you heard this before? Yes, she replied quietly. That's why I decided to bring the phone. I'm afraid that Chanel provoked the conflict that led to her death. Do you think David Wilson acted in self-defense? I don't know. Tiffany shook her head. I just know that Chanel wasn't herself in the last few weeks. It was like Rachel's obsession had consumed her. She became a different person, angry, manipulative, dangerous. Clark nodded, taking notes. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Green. This is very important information. Leaving the police station, the detective headed straight for Rachel Wilson's house. After testifying in court, she had returned home. The judge had allowed David to remain under house arrest until the end of the trial thanks to her testimony. Rachel opened the door herself. Her pregnancy was already noticeable, and her face reflected the fatigue of the last few months. Detective Clark, she said, not looking surprised. Come in. Is your husband home? Clark asked as he walked into the living room. No, he's with his lawyer discussing closing arguments, Rachel replied, sitting down on the sofa. Would you like some coffee? No, thank you. Clark remained standing. Mrs. Wilson, I have some new information that could significantly affect the case. I'd like to talk to you in private before presenting it in court. Rachel nodded slowly, her hands instinctively falling on her stomach as if to protect her unborn child. What information? Clark took out Chanel's phone. Chanel Brown's friend gave me her phone. It contains numerous messages sent to you, as well as recordings of conversations with your husband. Rachel's face paled. I didn't know she was recording our conversations. And not just yours. Clark played the voice message that Chanel had sent to David. When the recording ended, a heavy silence hung in the room. Rachel sat motionless, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't herself those days. Rachel whispered finally. The Chanel I knew. She was different, creative, full of life. But when I told her I was pregnant and that I wanted to keep the family together, something in her broke. Mrs. Wilson. Clark sat down across from her. I think it's time to tell the truth about what happened on the night of the murder. This recording changes everything. If your husband acted under threat, protecting you and the baby. Rachel covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Clark waited silently for several minutes while she dealt with her emotions. That night, Rachel finally began, lowering her hands and looking directly at the detective. Chanel came to our house. She was drunk, out of control. She was screaming, demanding that I come out. David already knew about our relationship. He had intercepted one of her messages the day before. She took a deep breath, gathering her strength. Chanel threatened to tell everyone about us, said she would take me and the baby away. David went out to her, tried to calm her down, but she became even more aggressive. She said terrible things, that I never loved him, that the baby might not be his, that she wouldn't let me stay with him. The neighbors started peeking out of their windows. David offered to take her home to talk calmly. They left, and I never found out what happened after that. Not completely, but you guessed, Clark said quietly. Rachel nodded, wiping away her tears. When David came back late at night, his shirt was covered in blood. He was in shock, could barely speak. He just said that she kept threatening him, became violent, took a knife out of her bag, that everything got out of control. And you decided to give him an alibi, Clark stated. I felt guilty about everything, Rachel said, staring into space. If I hadn't started this relationship, if I had been honest from the beginning, Chanel would be alive. David wouldn't be on trial. Our child wouldn't have been born in the shadow of murder. She looked at the detective. And I was afraid. Afraid of being left alone with a child if David went to prison. Afraid that everyone would find out about my relationship with a woman. Our neighborhood is conservative. I could have lost my job, my friends. And I knew David didn't want to kill her. He was protecting us. Me and the baby. Clark looked at her for a long time, thinking about what he had heard. Finally, he said, Mrs. Wilson, you do understand that perjury is a crime, don't you? And that now that we have this evidence, the story looks very different? Rachel nodded slowly. What should I do? You need to change your testimony and tell the truth, Clark replied. With this new evidence, the court may consider self-defense or manslaughter. It won't get your husband off the hook, but it could significantly reduce his sentence. 3 days later, a new court hearing took place. The courtroom was packed. News of the unexpected turn in the Wilson case had spread quickly throughout the city. Rachel sat in the witness box, straight and pale, ready to finally tell the truth. Judge Lorraine Moore looked at her disapprovingly. Mrs. Wilson, you understand that by changing your testimony, you are admitting that you previously lied under oath? Yes, Your Honor, Rachel replied quietly. I am prepared to accept the punishment for that, but I can no longer live a lie. She told everything about her relationship with Chanel, how she tried to break it off when she found out she was pregnant, about the harassment and threats, about the night of the murder when David took Chanel away from their home and returned with a bloodstained shirt. I protected him because I felt guilty about what happened, Rachel concluded, looking at the jury, and because I knew he was protecting us, me and our unborn child, from a man who had lost control and posed a real threat. The prosecutor presented new evidence. Chanel's phone with messages and recordings, and Tiffany Green's testimony about her friend's mental state in the last few days. The defense seized on this information, reworking their case to claim self-defense or manslaughter. David Wilson sat motionless, staring straight ahead. Only when Rachel passed him on her way back to her seat did their eyes meet. His gaze was a mixture of pain, gratitude, and humility. The trial lasted another week. Finally, the jury returned with its verdict: guilty of manslaughter. Taking into account all the circumstances of the case, the judge sentenced David Wilson to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Rachel, for perjury, received a 1-year suspended sentence and community service. The court took into account her situation and motives. A year later, on a warm spring day, Rachel Wilson stood in line at the Ohio State Prison. She was holding a little girl with dark curly hair and bright, curious eyes, Zoe, her and David's daughter, who was born 2 months after the verdict. The visiting room was spacious but featureless, with gray walls, plain tables and chairs, and guards standing around the perimeter. David entered dressed in a prison uniform, but standing tall and dignified. When he saw his wife and daughter, he smiled, his first real smile in a long time. "Here's your daddy, sweetie," Rachel said quietly, walking over to the table and sitting down across from her husband. David cautiously reached out his arms, and Rachel handed him their daughter. He held her gently, studying every feature of her face, every curl of her hair. "She's grown so much," he whispered, "and she looks even more like you." "She has your eyes," Rachel replied, "and your stubbornness." They sat silently, looking at their child, the fruit of their love, the proof of their struggle, the symbol of the price they had paid for truth and safety. In that silence, there was no need for words. They both knew what they had been through and what they still had to endure. Little Zoe looked from her father to her mother, unaware of the complexity of their story, unaware of the triangle of passion and lies that had brought them here. For her, only this moment existed: the warmth of her father's hands, the love in her mother's eyes. The guard announced that visiting time was coming to an end. David kissed his daughter gently on the forehead and handed her back to Rachel. "I love you both," he said simply. "We'll be waiting for you," Rachel replied, and her words were true, pure, without a shadow of a lie or doubt. As she left the prison, Rachel thought about the price of truth: high, painful, but necessary. She thought about how one decision, one moment of weakness, could change the lives of so many people. She thought about how lies, no matter how protective they may seem, ultimately only make the pain worse. Michael Turner was waiting for her in the parking lot, the only friend who had stayed with them after everything that had happened. He silently helped her put her child in the car seat, then got behind the wheel. "How is he?" Michael asked as he pulled onto the road. "He's hanging in there," Rachel replied, looking at her sleeping daughter. "In 2 years, he'll be eligible for parole." Michael nodded, focusing on the road. "And you?" Rachel was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the city passing by, the place where their tragedy had unfolded, where 3 lives had become entangled in a deadly triangle of passion, jealousy, and fear. "I'm learning to live with the truth," she finally replied. "No matter how bitter it is,